The morning sun painted the cobblestone streets of Windsor with golden light as Sarah hurried toward the castle gates. Her worn sneakers made soft sounds against the ancient stones, and her heart pounded with nervous energy. Today was different. Today, she had to do something that could change everything. Sarah clutched the small piece of paper in her pocket. The address was written in her grandmother's shaky handwriting, along with a phone number and a name, Detective Inspector James Morrison. Her grandmother had pressed it into her hands 3 days ago, just before she passed away in the hospital bed. "Promise me, Sarah," her grandmother had whispered, her voice barely audible above the beeping machines. "Promise me you'll find him. Tell him about the van. Tell him what I saw that night 20 years ago." Sarah had promised, even though she didn't understand what her grandmother meant. Now, standing outside Windsor Castle where Detective Inspector Morrison worked as a royal guard, she felt the weight of that promise. The castle stood majestically before her, its towers reaching toward the cloudy sky. Tourists moved in groups, taking pictures and chattering excitedly. Sarah felt out of place in her simple jeans and sweater among the well-dressed visitors. She spotted a guard in his traditional red uniform standing near the main entrance. His posture was straight and professional, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced attention. This had to be him. Sarah took a deep breath and approached. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Are you Detective Inspector James Morrison?" The guard turned to look at her. He was a man in his 40s with kind brown eyes and graying hair visible beneath his ceremonial hat. There was something gentle about his face that made Sarah feel a little less nervous. "I am," he replied, his voice carrying a slight accent. "How can I help you, miss?" Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out the piece of paper. "My grandmother, Margaret Sullivan, she asked me to find you. She said to tell you about a van. She said you would understand." James Morrison's expression changed immediately. The professional mask slipped away, replaced by something Sarah couldn't quite identify. Surprise? Fear? Recognition? "Margaret Sullivan," he repeated slowly, as if testing the name on his tongue. "I haven't heard that name in 20 years. She died 3 days ago," Sarah continued, fighting back tears. "But, before she passed, she made me promise to find you. She said there was something you needed to know about what happened that night." James looked around quickly, noting the tourists and other guards nearby. His training kicked in, and he realized this conversation needed to happen somewhere private. "Miss Sullivan," he said formally, "I'm afraid I can't discuss personal matters while on duty. However, my shift ends at 6 o'clock. Would you be willing to meet me at the Crown and Anchor pub on Thames Street? It's just a 15-minute walk from here." Sarah nodded eagerly. "Yes, of course. 6 o'clock. Good," James said, then paused. "Miss Sullivan, before you go, can you tell me one thing? Did your grandmother ever mention a blue van? A Ford Transit from the early 2000s? Sarah's eyes widened. "Yes. She wrote it down." She unfolded the paper and showed him her grandmother's notes. Written in faded ink were the words, "Blue Ford Transit, license plate ending in 247, damaged rear bumper." James felt his knees go weak. After 20 years, someone finally had information about the van that had haunted his dreams. The hours until 6 o'clock passed slowly for both Sarah and James. Sarah spent the afternoon walking through Windsor, thinking about her grandmother and trying to piece together the mystery. She had always known her grandmother kept secrets. There were nights when she would wake up to find Margaret sitting by the window, staring out at the street as if watching for something. Margaret had lived in a small flat in East London her entire adult life. She worked as a cleaning lady at various office buildings, always taking the late shift that paid a little extra. She was a quiet woman who kept to herself, but she had raised Sarah with love and kindness after Sarah's parents died in a car accident when she was 8. Growing up, Sarah often wondered why her grandmother seemed so afraid of certain things. She would never walk alone at night, always insisted on checking locks multiple times, and had an unusual fear of dark-colored vans. Now, sitting on a bench near the castle, Sarah began to understand that her grandmother's fears might have been based on something real. Meanwhile, James struggled to concentrate on his duties. The blue van had been the key piece of evidence in a case that had destroyed his career as a detective 20 years ago. He had been a young, ambitious officer then, working for the Metropolitan Police. The case involved a series of break-ins at government offices, always occurring late at night when the buildings were supposedly empty. The pattern had been clear to James. Someone was using inside information to target specific offices, stealing documents rather than valuables. The thefts were sophisticated, professional, and pointed to corruption at high levels. James had been getting close to solving the case when everything went wrong. He had traced the break-ins to a blue Ford Transit van that was seen near each crime scene. The van belonged to a cleaning company that serviced government buildings. James was preparing to make arrests when his superiors suddenly shut down the investigation. Insufficient evidence, his chief inspector had said. The case is being transferred to a special unit. But James knew better. Someone with power and influence had made the case disappear. When he tried to pursue it on his own time, he found himself transferred to a desk job, then, eventually pushed out of the police force entirely. He had been lucky to find work as a royal guard, but the failed case had followed him like a shadow. The blue van had vanished completely. The cleaning company claimed it had been sold, but there were no records of the sale. The case files disappeared from the archives. Even James's own notes went missing from his desk. It was as if the entire investigation had been erased. Over the years, James had tried to forget about it. He had built a new life, found some measure of peace in his work at the castle. But he never stopped wondering what had really happened, and who had been powerful enough to make an entire police investigation disappear. As 6 o'clock approached, James changed out of his uniform and walked toward the Crown and Anchor. His heart was beating faster than it had in years. After 20 years of questions, he might finally get some answers. The pub was a traditional English tavern with dark wooden beams and dim lighting. James arrived first and chose a quiet table in the back corner. When Sarah walked in, he waved her over. "Thank you for meeting me," Sarah said as she sat down. "I ordered us both tea. I hope that's all right." "That's perfect," Sarah replied. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag. "I wrote down everything I could remember about what my grandmother told me over the years. I never understood it before, but now I think it might be important." James leaned forward eagerly. "Please, tell me everything." Sarah opened the notebook and began to read. "My grandmother worked as a night cleaner for a company called Metropolitan Services. She cleaned government offices in central London from 1995 to 2005. She always worked alone, usually starting around midnight." Metropolitan Services, James repeated. That was the company that owned the blue van. In 2003, Sarah continued, she was working late at an office building on Whitehall. She told me she always finished her assigned floors by 3 in the morning, but that night she had to go back because she forgot her keys in one of the offices. James felt a chill run down his spine. The break-ins had all occurred between 3 and 4 in the morning. When she went back inside, Sarah said, she saw 3 men in suits going through filing cabinets in one of the offices. They had a blue van parked in the alley behind the building. She hid and watched them load boxes of documents into the van. Did she recognize any of the men? She said one of them was wearing an expensive watch and had a scar on his left hand. Another one had white hair and spoke with an accent she couldn't place. The third man was younger, maybe in his 30s, and he seemed to be in charge. James was writing furiously in his own notebook. These details matched witness descriptions from other break-ins, but no one had ever been able to identify the men. My grandmother was scared, Sarah continued. She knew she wasn't supposed to see what she saw. She waited until they left, then she went home and never spoke about it. But why didn't she report it to the police? Sarah's expression grew sad. The next day, she went to work as usual. But her supervisor called her into the office and told her that her services were no longer needed. They said budget cuts meant they had to let some people go, but my grandmother knew it was because of what she had seen. They fired her to keep her quiet. Yes. And then, strange things started happening. Someone broke into her flat, but nothing was stolen. She would get phone calls in the middle of the night with no one on the other end. A man in a dark coat started following her when she went shopping. James felt anger rising in his chest. An innocent woman had been terrorized simply because she had witnessed a crime. My grandmother was smart, though, Sarah continued. She kept detailed records of everything. She wrote down license plate numbers, descriptions of the men who followed her, dates and times of the harassment. She also kept newspaper clippings about government scandals that seemed related to what she had seen. Do you still have those records? Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Everything is here. 20 years worth of notes, photographs, and documents. She made me promise to give them to someone who could do something about it. James opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were dozens of pages covered in Margaret's careful handwriting. There were photographs taken with a cheap camera, showing men in dark clothing lurking near her building. There were copies of newspaper articles about missing government documents and political scandals. But, most importantly, there were detailed notes about the night she witnessed the break-in. Margaret had written down every detail she could remember: the time, the weather, the exact location of the van, even the brand of cigarettes one of the men had been smoking. "This is incredible," James whispered. "Your grandmother documented everything perfectly." "She was scared for 20 years, Sarah said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. She never felt safe, never felt like she could trust anyone. But she never stopped believing that someday, someone would listen to her story." James looked up from the documents. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. The case I was working on 20 years ago, the one that destroyed my career, it was connected to what your grandmother saw. Powerful people made sure that investigation disappeared." "What kind of powerful people?" "I don't know for certain. But the pattern of break-ins, the specific offices that were targeted, the fact that only certain types of documents were stolen, it all pointed to someone with access to classified information." Sarah felt a chill of fear. "Are you saying my grandmother was right to be scared?" "I'm saying your grandmother was very brave," James replied. "And very smart to wait 20 years before coming forward. But now that this information exists, we have a responsibility to do something with it." They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the weight of what they had discovered. The pub continued its evening bustle around them, but their corner felt isolated from the normal world. "There's something else," Sarah said finally. "My grandmother mentioned that she saw the same blue van 3 more times over the next 6 months. Always in different locations, always late at night when she was walking home from her new cleaning job." "She kept track of it?" "She wrote down everything. Dates, times, locations. She even followed it once to see where it went." James felt his pulse quicken. "Where did it go?" "To a warehouse in East London." She didn't get close enough to see inside, but she noted the address. Sarah flipped through the notebook and found the page. Unit 47, Docklands Industrial Estate. She also wrote down the names of the businesses that shared the building. James stared at the address. After 20 years, he finally had a lead that could crack open the case that had haunted him. But he also realized that pursuing this information could put both him and Sarah in danger. "Sarah," he said seriously, "I want you to understand what we're dealing with here. If your grandmother was right, if this goes as high as I think it does, then investigating this could be dangerous." "My grandmother lived in fear for 20 years because no one would listen to her," Sarah replied firmly. "I won't let her death be meaningless. Whatever it takes, we need to find out the truth." James studied her face and saw the same determination that had driven him to become a police officer years ago. Despite the danger, despite the unknown forces they might be up against, he knew they had to see this through. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this carefully. We don't trust anyone until we know more about who was involved in covering this up." As they prepared to leave the pub, James felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years: hope. Margaret Sullivan had given them the key to a puzzle that many people had tried very hard to bury. Now it was up to him and Sarah to unlock the truth, no matter where it led them. The story was just beginning, and neither of them could imagine how much their lives were about to change. The next morning, James woke up before his alarm clock rang. He had barely slept, his mind racing through the documents Sarah had given him. Margaret Sullivan's careful records painted a picture of a conspiracy that went deeper than he had ever imagined during his original investigation. James lived in a small flat near Windsor, a modest place that reflected his simple life as a royal guard. The walls were mostly bare except for a few photographs from his police days and a commendation he had received for bravery early in his career. He had tried to put his detective past behind him, but now it came rushing back with full force. He spread Margaret's documents across his kitchen table, organizing them chronologically. The pattern became clearer with each page. The break-ins hadn't been random acts of theft. They were part of a systematic operation to steal specific documents related to government defense contracts. Margaret had noted which offices were targeted: the Ministry of Defense Procurement Division, the Cabinet Office security briefings, and several departments responsible for classified military purchases. The stolen documents weren't state secrets that could be sold to foreign governments. They were financial records and contract details that could be worth millions to the right bidder. James realized this wasn't espionage. It was corruption on a massive scale. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "I couldn't sleep either," she said when he answered. "I keep thinking about what my grandmother went through. 20 years of looking over her shoulder, 20 years of being afraid." "I've been going through her documents," James replied. "Sarah, this is bigger than just a few stolen files. Your grandmother uncovered evidence of systematic corruption in government defense contracts." "What does that mean?" "It means someone was stealing information about military purchases and selling it to private companies. Those companies could then underbid their competitors because they knew exactly what the government was willing to pay." Sarah felt overwhelmed. "How much money are we talking about?" "Based on the contracts mentioned in these documents, potentially hundreds of millions of pounds over several years." There was silence on the line as Sarah processed this information. Finally, she spoke. "My grandmother was just a cleaning lady. She never had much money, never owned anything valuable. But she stumbled onto something worth hundreds of millions?" "That's exactly why they tried to silence her," James said gently. "She was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she saw something that could have exposed the whole operation." "What do we do now?" James had been thinking about this all night. "We need more evidence before we go to the authorities. If this conspiracy includes people in high government positions, we can't trust the normal channels. We need to be absolutely certain of our facts." "The warehouse," Sarah said. "My grandmother's notes about the warehouse in East London. Should we check it out?" James hesitated. After 20 years, it was unlikely they would find anything useful at the warehouse. But Margaret's notes were so detailed, so carefully documented, that they might still uncover some evidence. "It's risky," he said finally. "But, yes, I think we should take a look. However, we need to be extremely careful. If this operation is still active, if the same people are still involved, they won't hesitate to protect their interests." They agreed to meet that afternoon. James would take a sick day from his duties at the castle, and Sarah would drive them to East London in her grandmother's old car. The journey to Docklands took them through some of London's most historic neighborhoods, but neither James nor Sarah paid much attention to the scenery. They were both lost in their own thoughts, contemplating the magnitude of what they had discovered. "Tell me about your grandmother," James said as they drove through the city traffic. "What was she like before all this happened?" Sarah smiled sadly. "She was different when I was very young. I have vague memories of her laughing more, being more relaxed. She used to take me to the park on Sundays, and we would feed the ducks and have picnics." "When did that change?" "Gradually, over the years. She became more careful about everything. She would check the locks on the doors multiple times before bed. She never threw away any mail or documents, always kept everything in boxes in her closet. She would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and look out the windows. James felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. Margaret Sullivan had been robbed of her peace of mind for 2 decades, all because she had accidentally witnessed a crime. Did she ever try to contact the police again after that first incident? Once, Sarah replied. About 5 years ago, she read a newspaper article about a defense contract scandal. She thought it might be related to what she had seen, so she called the police tip line. What happened? 2 days later, she received a phone call. A man's voice told her that she should focus on her own life and stop worrying about things that didn't concern her. The caller knew her full name, her address, even my name and where I went to school. James felt a chill. Someone had been monitoring Margaret Sullivan for 20 years, making sure she didn't cause any problems. That's when she started writing everything down in more detail, Sarah continued. She realized that someday, someone might need to know the whole story. She made copies of everything and hid them in different places. There are more documents? 3 complete sets. One in her safety deposit box at the bank, one hidden in her flat, and one that she gave to a neighbor she trusted. James realized they were dealing with a woman who had been far more strategic and intelligent than anyone had given her credit for. Margaret Sullivan hadn't just been a victim. She had been building a case for 20 years, waiting for the right person to help her bring it to light. The Docklands industrial estate was a sprawling collection of warehouses and office buildings near the Thames. It had been developed in the 1990s as part of London's economic expansion, but many of the buildings now showed signs of age and neglect. They found Unit 47 without much difficulty. It was a large warehouse with a small office attached to the front. The sign by the door read Consolidated Shipping Services, but the building looked largely abandoned. James parked across the street and they observed the property for several minutes. There were no cars in the parking area, no signs of activity. According to your grandmother's notes, she followed the blue van here in late 2003, James said. But that was over 20 years ago. The business has probably changed hands multiple times since then. Should we try to get inside? Not yet. Let's see what we can learn about the current owners first. They drove to the estate's main office, where a bored-looking security guard sat behind a reception desk. James had changed out of his Royal Guard uniform and dressed in casual clothes, hoping to avoid attracting attention. Excuse me, he said to the guard. I'm trying to get in touch with the people who run Unit 47. Consolidated Shipping Services. The guard looked up from his newspaper. Unit 47? That place has been empty for years. The lease expired and nobody renewed it. Do you know who owned it before? Some shipping company, but they cleared out around 2008 or 2009. During the financial crisis, a lot of businesses here went under. James thanked the guard and they returned to the car. The timing was interesting. The warehouse had been abandoned shortly after the financial crisis, but also around the time when government oversight of defense contracts had been strengthened following several scandals. It fits the pattern, James told Sarah. If this was part of a long-term operation, they would have shut it down when the risks became too high. So we're too late? Maybe not. Let's take a closer look at the building. Sometimes abandoned places tell their own stories. They waited until the security guard's attention was focused on his newspaper, then walked casually toward Unit 47. The front entrance was secured with a heavy padlock, but James noticed that one of the side windows had a broken latch. I'm going to look inside, he told Sarah. Keep watch for me. James carefully opened the window and climbed into the warehouse. The interior was mostly empty, but not completely clean. There were marks on the concrete floor where heavy equipment had been stored, and several pieces of paper scattered in the corners. He used his phone's flashlight to examine the debris. Most of it was meaningless old shipping receipts, equipment manuals, fragments of invoices. But, in the far corner of the building, he found something interesting. Hidden beneath a piece of torn cardboard was a small metal plate that had obviously fallen off a piece of machinery. The plate bore a serial number and the logo of a company called Thames Valley Electronics. James photographed the plate, then searched the rest of the warehouse more systematically. Near what had obviously been an office area, he found the remains of a filing cabinet that had been hastily emptied. Most of the papers were gone, but a few fragments remained stuck in the back of the drawers. One fragment contained part of a letterhead, Ministry of Defense, Procurement Division. Another showed part of a contract number and a date from 2004. James felt his heart racing. 20 years later, Margaret Sullivan's information was still leading them to evidence. As he prepared to leave the warehouse, James heard voices outside. He quickly moved to the window and saw two men in expensive suits talking to Sarah. His training kicked in immediately. These men didn't look like estate security or casual visitors. One of the men was showing Sarah some kind of identification. Even from a distance, James could see that Sarah looked nervous and uncomfortable. He climbed out of the window as quietly as possible and approached from behind a parked truck. As he got closer, he could hear parts of the conversation. "We're investigating some irregularities in the area," one of the men was saying. "We need to ask you a few questions about why you're here." "I'm just looking around," Sarah replied, her voice shaking slightly. "My grandmother used to work in this area." "Your grandmother? What was her name?" James felt alarm bells going off in his head. These men weren't police or estate security. They were asking too many specific questions, and their interest in Sarah's grandmother was deeply suspicious. He moved closer, staying hidden behind vehicles, until he could see both men clearly. One was in his 50s with white hair and wore an expensive watch. The other was younger, perhaps 40, and seemed to be in charge of the conversation. Margaret's description from 20 years ago flashed through James's mind. One of them had white hair and spoke with an accent. The third man was younger, maybe in his 30s, and he seemed to be in charge. 20 years later, and the same people were still protecting their secrets. James realized he had to act quickly. Sarah was in danger, and these men obviously knew more about Margaret Sullivan than they were letting on. He pulled out his phone and started recording, then stepped out from behind the truck. "Sarah," he called out loudly. "There you are. I've been looking for you." The two men turned to look at him, and James saw recognition flash in their eyes. They knew who he was. After 20 years, they remembered the detective who had gotten too close to their operation. "We need to go," James said firmly, walking directly toward Sarah. "I just got a call. Your aunt is waiting for us." Sarah understood immediately and started walking toward him. But the older man stepped into their path. "I don't think you understand," the man said, his accent now clearly noticeable. "We need to finish our conversation with the young lady." "And I don't think you understand," James replied, his voice carrying all the authority of his police training. "We're leaving now." The tension in the air was palpable. James could see that both men were calculating their options. They were clearly used to intimidating people, but James's confident manner and Sarah's obvious willingness to leave with him complicated their plans. Finally, the younger man spoke. "This doesn't have to be difficult. We just want to know what brought you here today." "Tourism," James said flatly. "Now, if you'll excuse us." He took Sarah's arm and guided her toward their car. The two men followed at a distance, but didn't try to stop them physically. As they drove away from the industrial estate, James could see in his rearview mirror that the men were writing down their license plate number. "Who were those people?" Sarah asked, her voice still shaking. "I think they were some of the same people your grandmother saw 20 years ago," James replied grimly. "Which means this conspiracy is still active, and they're still monitoring anyone who gets too close to the truth." The reality of their situation was becoming clear. They weren't just investigating a historical crime. They had stumbled onto an ongoing operation that powerful people were still willing to protect. As they drove back toward central London, James's mind was racing through their options. Going to the police was risky if the conspiracy included people in government. But, continuing their investigation alone could put both of them in serious danger. "Sarah," he said finally, "I think we need help. Professional help from someone we can trust." "Who can we trust if we don't know how deep this goes?" James thought about this carefully. "I have a friend who works for the Serious Fraud Office. She's someone I've known for 15 years, someone who wasn't involved in my original investigation. If anyone can help us navigate this safely, it's her. Do you think she'll believe us? After what happened today, after seeing those men's reaction to our presence, I think she'll have to take us seriously." James felt a mixture of excitement and fear. They were closer to the truth than anyone had been in 20 years, but they had also attracted the attention of people who had already proven they would go to great lengths to protect their secrets. Margaret Sullivan's 20-year quest for justice was finally moving forward, but the path ahead was fraught with dangers that none of them had anticipated. Detective Inspector Elena Rodriguez had built her career on following money trails that others couldn't see. As a senior investigator with the Serious Fraud Office, she had exposed corruption schemes involving millions of pounds and brought down some of the most sophisticated financial criminals in Britain. But the case that James Morrison brought to her office on a rainy Thursday morning was unlike anything she had encountered. Elena had known James for 15 years, since their early days in law enforcement. She remembered him as a brilliant detective with an instinct for complex cases. His forced departure from the Metropolitan Police had always seemed suspicious to her, but they had lost touch over the years as their careers took different paths. Now, sitting across from James and a young woman named Sarah Sullivan in her cramped office overlooking the Thames, Elena listened with growing amazement as they laid out their evidence. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Elena said, reviewing the documents spread across her desk. "You're alleging that a conspiracy involving government officials and private contractors has been operating for over 20 years, stealing classified information about defense contracts and using that information to manipulate bidding processes?" "That's exactly what we're saying," James replied. "And we have documentation to prove it." Elena picked up one of Margaret Sullivan's notebooks and flipped through the pages. The handwriting was careful and precise, the observations detailed and methodical. This wasn't the work of someone with a conspiracy theory. This was the documentation of someone who had witnessed real crimes. "The financial implications alone are staggering," Elena continued, studying a list of contracts that Margaret had connected to the break-ins. "If what you're suggesting is true, we're talking about fraud in the hundreds of millions. Probably more," Sarah added quietly. "My grandmother only documented what she could observe personally. There could be many more cases we don't know about." Elena had to admit that the evidence was compelling. Margaret Sullivan's records correlated with several defense contract scandals that had made headlines over the years. Companies that had won major government contracts despite submitting bids that seemed impossibly precise. Procurement decisions that had been questioned by Parliament but never fully investigated. "The warehouse visit yesterday concerns me," Elena said, looking directly at James. "You're certain these men recognized you?" "Absolutely. The older man matched your grandmother's description from 20 years ago, and their reaction when they saw me was immediate recognition." Elena leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. If the same people were still actively protecting this conspiracy after 2 decades, it meant the operation was ongoing and involved individuals with significant power and resources. "I need to be completely honest with you both," she said finally. "If we pursue this investigation officially, you'll be putting yourselves at considerable risk. These people have already demonstrated their willingness to intimidate witnesses and manipulate official investigations." "My grandmother lived in fear for 20 years, Sarah replied with determination. "I won't let her sacrifice be meaningless." Elena studied Sarah's face and saw the same resolve that drove the best investigators she had worked with. Despite the danger, despite the odds against them, this young woman was committed to seeing justice done. "All right," Elena said, making her decision. "But we do this properly. No more amateur investigating. No more visits to warehouses without backup. If we're going to take on a conspiracy this significant, we need to build an airtight case." Over the next several hours, Elena outlined a strategy for their investigation. The first step would be to verify Margaret Sullivan's observations using official records. Elena had access to government databases that could confirm details about the companies involved, the contracts in question, and the timing of various procurement decisions. I also want to bring in a colleague from the National Crime Agency, Elena said. Detective Chief Inspector Marcus Webb specializes in long-term conspiracy cases. He has the experience and resources to help us navigate the political complexities we're likely to face. James felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. After 20 years of carrying the weight of his failed investigation alone, he was finally part of a team with the authority and expertise to pursue the truth. But he also knew that officially reopening this case would make them targets for whoever had buried it the first time. As Elena made phone calls to set up meetings with her colleagues, Sarah found herself thinking about her grandmother's final days in the hospital. Margaret had seemed almost peaceful after making Sarah promise to find James Morrison. It was as if she knew her long vigil was finally coming to an end. She never gave up, Sarah said to James as they waited in Elena's office. Even when she was afraid, even when people told her to forget what she had seen, she kept documenting everything. She was remarkable, James agreed. Most people would have just tried to move on with their lives. I think she knew that what she witnessed was bigger than her own safety. She understood that corruption on this scale affects everyone. Detective Chief Inspector Marcus Webb arrived at Elena's office that afternoon. He was a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His reputation for handling sensitive investigations involving government officials was legendary within law enforcement circles. Webb listened without interruption as Elena, James, and Sarah presented their evidence. He asked few questions, but James could see that he was mentally cataloging every detail and assessing the credibility of their claims. The timeline is interesting, Webb said finally. The break-ins occurred during a period when the government was modernizing its procurement systems. New computer databases, digital contract management, consolidated bidding processes. Someone with inside knowledge could have exploited those system changes to gain access to sensitive information. How would they have known about the changes in advance? Sarah asked. That's the key question, Webb replied. This level of inside information suggests corruption at a very high level. Someone with access to cabinet-level briefings, or perhaps someone in the senior civil service. Elena spread out a timeline she had been constructing, matching Margaret's observations with official government records. I'd been cross-referencing the dates and locations from Mrs. Sullivan's notes with procurement decisions from that period. The correlation is remarkable. She pointed to specific entries. Here, your grandmother documented suspicious activity at the Ministry of Defense on March 15, 2003. 3 weeks later, a major radar system contract was awarded to Consolidated Defense Systems, despite their bid being significantly lower than their competitors. Lower by exactly the margin that would make them competitive, Webb added, studying the contract details. Not so low as to raise immediate suspicion, but perfectly calibrated to win the bid. James felt the familiar excitement of a case coming together. And Consolidated Defense Systems was one of the companies mentioned in the documents we found at the warehouse. I've been researching their corporate structure, Elena continued. The ownership is extremely complex, with multiple shell companies and offshore registrations. But, if we dig deep enough, we should be able to identify the real people behind it. Webb made a note in his own file. We'll need to coordinate with international colleagues. If this conspiracy involves offshore entities, we'll need cooperation from financial authorities in several countries. As the investigation plan became more detailed, the scope of what they were undertaking became clear. This wasn't just a case about stolen documents or fraudulent contracts. They were potentially exposing a systematic corruption network that had been operating at the highest levels of government for decades. I need to warn you all, Webb said seriously, that pursuing this investigation will require extraordinary security measures. If we're right about the scope of this conspiracy, we're dealing with people who have already demonstrated their willingness to obstruct justice and intimidate witnesses. What kind of security measures? Sarah asked. Official protection for key witnesses, secure communication protocols, restricted access to case files. we'll also need to be extremely careful about who else we bring into the investigation. Elena nodded in agreement. The fact that James's original investigation was shut down so effectively 20 years ago tells us that someone with significant influence was protecting these people. Could the same person still be involved? James asked. It's possible, Webb replied. But, more likely, we're dealing with an institutional protection system. When one person retires or moves on, someone else takes over the responsibility for maintaining the cover-up. The implications were sobering. They weren't just fighting individual criminals. They were challenging a system that had been protecting itself for decades. As evening approached, Webb outlined the next phase of their investigation. Elena, I want you to focus on the financial analysis. Map out every contract mentioned in Mrs. Sullivan's notes and trace the money flows. James, you'll work with our digital forensics team to see if we can recover any electronic records from that warehouse location. Sarah, I want you to go through your grandmother's remaining documents and help us build a comprehensive timeline. What about the men we encountered at the warehouse? James asked. We'll identify them, Webb said confidently. I have contacts in various agencies who can help us determine who they were and who they work for now. But, we approach this carefully. We can't afford to alert them that we're building a case. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt both excitement and fear. Her grandmother's 20-year quest for justice was finally being taken seriously by people with the authority to act. But, she also understood that they were embarking on a dangerous path. Detective Inspector Webb, she said as they prepared to leave. My grandmother never wanted to be a hero. She just wanted someone to know the truth. Will this investigation really lead to justice, or will it be buried again like it was 20 years ago? Webb considered her question carefully. I can't promise you that powerful people won't try to stop us. But, I can promise you that we have tools and protections now that didn't exist 20 years ago. Financial crimes are taken much more seriously today, and there's greater oversight of government procurement processes. Plus, Elena added, we have your grandmother's documentation. 20 years of careful record-keeping by someone with no agenda other than truth. That's evidence that's very difficult to discredit or make disappear. As they left Elena's office and walked into the London evening, James felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, hope that justice might actually be possible. But, he also couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they parted ways at the underground station, he noticed a man in a dark coat who seemed to be paying too much attention to their group. 20 years ago, Margaret Sullivan had been terrorized by people who wanted to silence her. Now, as her granddaughter and the detective she had trusted began to expose the truth, it seemed that same pattern of intimidation might be starting again. The investigation was gaining momentum, but so were the risks. The powerful people who had protected this conspiracy for 2 decades would not give up without a fight. James took a circuitous route home, changing trains twice and doubling back to make sure he wasn't being followed. As he finally reached his flat near Windsor Castle, he realized that his life as a quiet royal guard was about to end. Margaret Sullivan's blue van had led them into a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and business. The truth she had died protecting was finally coming to light, but the cost of that truth remained to be seen. In her small flat in East London, Sarah carefully locked all the doors and windows before settling down to review her grandmother's remaining documents. As she read through 20 years of careful observations, she felt Margaret's presence watching over her. We're going to get them, Grandma, she whispered to the empty room. Finally, after all these years, we're going to get them. But, outside her window, a dark car had been parked across the street for the past hour. The same people who had monitored Margaret Sullivan for 20 years were now watching her granddaughter. The investigation was just beginning, but the conspiracy was already fighting back. 3 months after Sarah first approached James outside Windsor Castle, the investigation had grown into one of the largest fraud cases in British history. The secure conference room in the Serious Fraud Office had become their command center, its walls covered with photographs, timelines, and financial charts that mapped out 20 years of systematic corruption. Elena Rodriguez stood before a whiteboard covered with names and connections, briefing the expanded team that now included investigators from multiple agencies. The evidence had grown far beyond Margaret Sullivan's original observations. We've identified 47 separate incidents of document theft between 2001 and 2007, Elena announced to the room. Each incident preceded a major defense contract award, and, in every case, the winning bid was suspiciously precise. Detective Chief Inspector Webb added his own findings. The financial analysis shows that 8 companies benefited from this scheme, sharing contracts worth over £400 million. But, here's what's interesting, all 8 companies trace back to a single holding group controlled by 3 individuals. James studied the photographs on the wall showing the 3 men who had orchestrated the conspiracy. After months of investigation, they finally had names and backgrounds for the people Margaret Sullivan had seen that night 20 years ago. The leader was Sir Reginald Hartwell, a former civil servant who had left government service in 1999 to start a consulting firm. His insider knowledge of procurement processes and his maintained relationships with current officials had made him the perfect coordinator for the scheme. The second man was Viktor Kozlov, a former Eastern European defense contractor who had relocated to London in the 1990s. His international connections had provided the offshore companies and complex financial structures needed to hide the conspiracy's profits. The third was David Whitmore, who had worked as a security contractor for various government agencies. His access to buildings and computer systems had made the document thefts possible. We've also identified their government contact, Webb continued, pointing to a photograph of a distinguished-looking man in his 60s. Lord Edward Ashford, currently serving in the House of Lords, formerly permanent secretary at the Ministry of Defence. Sarah felt a chill as she looked at the photograph. This was the man who had protected her grandmother's tormentors for 20 years, the person with enough influence to bury police investigations and intimidate witnesses. Ashford was perfectly positioned, Elena explained. He knew about procurement decisions before they were publicly announced, and he had the authority to influence which documents were classified as sensitive. But gathering evidence against such powerful people had proven extremely dangerous. 2 weeks into the official investigation, Sarah's flat had been broken into. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear: they were being watched. James's situation had become even more precarious. Someone had filed a complaint about his conduct at Windsor Castle, leading to an internal investigation that threatened his employment. Only Webb's intervention and the official protection status of their investigation had prevented James from being suspended. "They're trying to isolate us," Webb had explained during a security briefing. "Make us vulnerable by destroying our normal support systems." The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Margaret Sullivan's neighbor, Mrs. Patel, had contacted Sarah after seeing news reports about the investigation. For 20 years, she had been keeping a box of documents that Margaret had asked her to hold. "Your grandmother said if anything happened to her, I should give these to someone who could help," Mrs. Patel had explained, handing over a sealed envelope. Inside were copies of financial records that Margaret had somehow obtained during her years of surveillance. Bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and corporate documents that directly linked the conspiracy members to offshore accounts receiving millions in fraudulent profits. "She was more resourceful than any of us realized," Elena had said with admiration. Margaret Sullivan wasn't just documenting what she observed. She was actively investigating. The financial evidence had provided the final pieces needed to build criminal cases against all members of the conspiracy. But, as they prepared for arrests, the political pressure mounted. Sarah received a phone call from someone identifying himself as a representative of Lord Ashford. The man's voice was polite but menacing as he suggested that Sarah might want to reconsider her involvement in the investigation. "Your grandmother lived quietly for 20 years after her unfortunate misunderstanding," the caller said. "Perhaps you should follow her example and focus on your own life." Sarah had immediately reported the call to Webb, who arranged for official protection. But the message was clear: even with official backing, they were still targets. James had faced more direct intimidation. Someone had accessed his personnel file at Windsor Castle and distributed copies to tabloid newspapers, along with fabricated stories about his conduct as a royal guard. Only the intervention of his supervisors, who recognized the timing as suspicious, had prevented the false stories from being published. They're getting desperate, Webb observed during a team meeting. The closer we get to filing charges, the more aggressive their tactics become. Elena had tracked the conspiracy's financial network across 7 countries, working with international law enforcement agencies to freeze assets and gather additional evidence. The scope of their findings had attracted attention from the highest levels of government. The Prime Minister's office has been briefed, Webb announced during what would be their final planning meeting. We have authorization to proceed with arrests, but we need to move quickly before anyone else can interfere. The arrests were scheduled for dawn on a Tuesday morning in November. Teams of officers would simultaneously target all 6 main conspiracy members at their homes and offices. After 20 years of impunity, the people who had terrorized Margaret Sullivan would finally face justice. Sarah couldn't sleep the night before the arrests. She sat in her grandmother's flat, surrounded by the documents and photographs that had consumed her life for the past 3 months. Margaret's careful handwriting filled dozens of notebooks, a testament to 2 decades of patient observation and quiet courage. "You did it, Grandma," Sarah whispered to the silent room. "You never gave up, and now they're going to pay for what they did." At exactly 6 in the morning, James received a phone call from Webb. "It's done," the chief inspector said simply. All 6 arrests completed without incident. The news broke across British media within hours. The BBC led with the story of a 20-year conspiracy that had defrauded the government of hundreds of millions of pounds. Sky News focused on the role of Lord Ashford and the political implications of his arrest. The Guardian published a detailed analysis of how the scheme had operated and why it had remained hidden for so long. But, for Sarah, the most meaningful coverage was a smaller story in the local London paper that focused on Margaret Sullivan herself. The article described her as an ordinary woman who uncovered extraordinary corruption and featured a photograph of Margaret from her younger days, smiling and confident. The trial took 18 months to complete, with testimony from over 200 witnesses and evidence that filled dozens of boxes. James testified about his original investigation and the systematic efforts to suppress it. Elena presented the financial evidence that traced millions of pounds in fraudulent profits. Sarah told the court about her grandmother's 20 years of fear and vigilance. The most dramatic moment came when prosecutors presented video evidence recovered from the warehouse. Digital forensics experts had found fragments of security camera recordings that showed the conspiracy members loading stolen documents into the blue van that Margaret had observed. After 24 years, the van that had haunted Margaret Sullivan's dreams was finally providing evidence for her vindication. Sir Reginald Hartwell was sentenced to 14 years in prison for conspiracy to commit fraud and theft of government property. Viktor Kozlov received 12 years for his role in money laundering and operating the offshore financial network. David Whitmore was sentenced to 8 years for theft and computer crimes. Lord Edward Ashford's trial was separate due to his status as a peer. The evidence against him included phone records showing hundreds of calls to the other conspiracy members, as well as financial records proving he had received over £3 million in payments to offshore accounts. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison and stripped of his peerage. The 2 remaining members of the conspiracy, mid-level government employees who had provided inside information, received sentences of 5 and 6 years respectively. But the most significant outcome was the comprehensive reform of government procurement processes that resulted from the scandal. New oversight systems, transparent bidding requirements, and enhanced security protocols were implemented to prevent similar corruption in the future. Sarah attended every day of the trials, often sitting next to James in the public gallery. They had become close friends during the investigation, bonded by their shared commitment to Margaret Sullivan's memory. On the final day of Lord Ashford's sentencing, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been done, but her grandmother hadn't lived to see it. She knew this day would come, James said as they walked out of the courthouse together. Margaret never gave up hope that someone would eventually listen to her story. Elena Rodriguez, who had been promoted to deputy director of the Serious Fraud Office partly based on her work on the case, approached them outside the courthouse. "There's something you should know," she said to Sarah. "The government has decided to name the new Procurement Oversight Board the Margaret Sullivan Committee. Your grandmother's name will be permanently associated with preventing the kind of corruption she uncovered." Sarah felt tears in her eyes. After 20 years of being ignored and intimidated, Margaret Sullivan would be remembered as a hero. But there was one more surprise waiting. James had submitted a formal request to have Margaret Sullivan posthumously awarded the Queen's Commendation for public service. The application detailed her 2 decades of documenting evidence that ultimately led to the largest fraud prosecution in British history. 6 months after the trials ended, Sarah received an invitation to Windsor Castle for the award ceremony. Standing in the same courtyard where she had first approached James nearly 2 years earlier, she accepted the commendation on behalf of her grandmother. James, who had been promoted to senior investigative consultant for the Royal Security Services based on his work on the case, presented the award. Margaret Sullivan exemplified the highest ideals of civic duty, he said during the brief ceremony. Her courage and persistence in pursuing truth despite personal danger saved the British taxpayer hundreds of millions of pounds and led to crucial reforms in government accountability. As Sarah held the framed commendation, she thought about all the nights her grandmother had sat by the window, watching for blue vans and writing careful notes in her notebooks. Margaret had never sought recognition or reward. She had simply wanted someone to know the truth. Now, finally, everyone knew. The blue van that had terrorized Margaret Sullivan for 20 years had become the key evidence in bringing down a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The woman who had been dismissed as a frightened cleaning lady had proven to be one of the most important whistleblowers in British history. Sarah returned to her grandmother's flat that evening with the commendation and carefully placed it on the mantel next to Margaret's photographs. The flat felt peaceful in a way it never had before. The long vigil was finally over. A few weeks later, Sarah received a letter from a television production company interested in making a documentary about Margaret Sullivan's story. There had also been inquiries from publishers wanting to commission a book about the case. But Sarah declined all the offers. Her grandmother had never wanted fame or attention. She had simply wanted justice. Instead, Sarah established the Margaret Sullivan Foundation, using compensation money from the government to provide legal support for ordinary citizens who witnessed corruption but were afraid to come forward. The foundation's mission statement, written in Margaret's own words from one of her notebooks, read simply, "Sometimes ordinary people see extraordinary things, and they deserve to be heard." James continued his work in royal security, but also lectured at police academies about long-term conspiracy investigations. He often told Margaret Sullivan's story as an example of how patient documentation by civilian witnesses could be crucial in exposing complex crimes. Elena Rodriguez went on to head the International Financial Crime Task Force, using techniques developed during the Sullivan case to investigate corruption networks across Europe. She kept a photograph of Margaret on her desk as a reminder that even the most sophisticated conspiracies could be brought down by careful observation and persistent courage. The blue Ford Transit van, recovered from a private garage owned by Viktor Kozlov, was donated to the Metropolitan Police Museum. A placard next to the exhibit read, "This vehicle was used in a 20-year conspiracy to defraud the British government." The conspiracy was exposed through the careful documentation of civilian witness Margaret Sullivan, whose courage and persistence led to the conviction of 6 criminals and the recovery of over £400 million. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Margaret Sullivan was the simple fact that late-night cleaners in government buildings throughout London now worked under enhanced security protocols, with clear procedures for reporting suspicious activities and strong protections for witnesses. Margaret Sullivan had spent 20 years living in fear because she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Her granddaughter had ensured that no other witness would ever have to suffer in silence again. The woman who had stopped a royal guard about a van had changed everything, not just for the people involved in the conspiracy, but for the entire system of government accountability in Britain. Her story became a reminder that ordinary people, armed with nothing more than truth and persistence, could still bring down the powerful when those people abused their positions of trust. Margaret Sullivan's blue van had carried more than stolen documents. It had carried the seeds of justice that would eventually grow into one of the most significant corruption prosecutions in modern British history. And, in the end, that was exactly what an ordinary cleaning lady with extraordinary courage had always intended.